Why Iran reopened the Strait of Hormuz, then shut it again almost immediately. Iran's brief reopening of the Strait of Hormuz was never a clean return to normal. It was a conditional concession tied to ceasefire diplomacy, restricted shipping lanes, frozen Iranian assets, and a demand that Washington ease pressure. Tehran's later decision to reverse course was not a sudden contradiction. It was the collapse of an arrangement that Iran appears to have viewed as temporary, conditional, and reversible from the beginning. Shipping had not returned to normal operations. Access remained tightly controlled, and the threat of renewed restrictions was built into the reopening itself. The strait was reopened to stabilize a crisis, not to end one. Iran did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz because the crisis was over. It reopened it because, for a moment, Tehran saw a tactical advantage in appearing cooperative while trying to extract concessions. The brief reopening was tied to a wider arrangement involving ceasefire diplomacy, conditional passage under Iranian approval, and the possible release of roughly $30 billion in Iranian funds blocked by U.S. sanctions. Iran said the Revolutionary Guards would control access to the shipping lanes, which would only be used if safe. That meant the reopening was never a true return to ordinary navigation. It was a managed reopening on Iranian terms, with Tehran attempting to convert military disruption into diplomatic and financial leverage. In effect, the reopening contained its own built-in threat. Iran was signaling that access could be granted, limited, or withdrawn depending on whether the wider pressure campaign against it changed. What Iran thought it was getting. Iran appears to have viewed the reopening as part of a deal, not as a goodwill gesture. The logic is fairly plain. Tehran was trying to show that it could ease pressure, but only if pressure on Iran also eased. There were at least 4 obvious incentives behind the move. First, Iran wanted to demonstrate that it could be both the actor that restores order and the one that disrupts it. After weeks in which the strait had become a symbol of threat and instability, reopening even part of that flow allowed Tehran to present itself as rational, measured, and in control. Second, Iran wanted financial relief. The reopening was linked to the possible unfreezing of Iranian assets, which suggests Tehran was not simply trying to win diplomatic headlines. It was trying to convert strategic pain into direct economic benefit. Third, Iran wanted recognition of its control. Requiring ships to coordinate with Iranian authorities and the Revolutionary Guards turns a global shipping route into an arena of Iranian discretion. Even when it looked like de-escalation, it was still an assertion of force and authority. Fourth, Iran wanted to test Washington. If the United States softened its posture, Tehran could argue that pressure had worked. If Washington maintained its stance, Iran could tighten restrictions again and assert that it received no meaningful concessions in return. Why it was never really open in the first place. This nuance is the point many readers miss. The strait was described as reopened, but the operational reality was much narrower. Only certain navigation lanes were available. Ships still needed Iranian approval and coordination, and serious safety concerns remained, including fears around mines and the wider military risk environment. Even after the reopening announcement, normal shipping had not resumed, and only a limited convoy of tankers had begun crossing. So when people ask why Iran reopened it and then shut it again, part of the answer is that the reopening was already weak, conditional, and reversible. It reduced panic, but it did not restore trust. It lowered the temperature, but it did not remove the threat. The strait had not moved from a war footing to a peace footing. It had moved from hard closure to unstable conditional access. Why Iran shut it again? Iran appears to have concluded that the United States had not meaningfully changed the underlying pressure. Restrictions were reimposed as the wider blockade and sanctions structure remained in place, and reports of gunfire involving vessels attempting to cross reinforced the sense that the reopening had failed to produce a stable or credible new normal. Tehran's position was that it had briefly loosened its grip, but the broader coercive framework around Iran had not eased enough to justify keeping Hormuz partially open. From Iran's perspective, reopening the strait had produced risk without enough reward. It had already sent a calming signal to markets and diplomacy. But if U.S. military and sanctions pressure remained substantially intact, Tehran may have concluded that it had surrendered leverage too cheaply. That makes the reversal easier to understand. This was not simply irrational escalation. It was coercive bargaining. Iran briefly loosened pressure to see whether it would be paid for doing so. When it judged that the return was insufficient, it tightened pressure again. The ceasefire helped reopen it, but was not strong enough to keep it open. The reopening was tied to a wider ceasefire framework, which indicates that Hormuz was not a side issue. It was central to the bargaining architecture. If the ceasefire reduced the immediate danger of wider war, Iran had a reason to partially restore commercial passage and present itself as responsive. But a ceasefire can reduce violence without resolving the underlying political argument. That appears to be what happened here. The reopening depended on a fragile chain of assumptions: that Iran would receive meaningful relief, that U.S. coercive pressure would visibly ease, that shipping companies would trust the route again, and that both sides would interpret the ceasefire in broadly compatible ways. Those assumptions did not hold. Passage remained restricted. The pressure structure did not disappear, and Tehran retained a standing warning that it could reverse course. So the reopening was real enough to make headlines, but too narrow and too politically fragile to survive. What most coverage misses. The mistake is to think in binaries: open or closed, peace or war, de-escalation or escalation. Hormuz is now being used as a variable pressure instrument. Iran does not need a permanently sealed strait to create global pain. It only needs uncertainty, selective access, insurance panic, convoy delays, and the possibility of sudden reversal. That is why the reopening and reclosure are not true opposites. They are part of the same strategy. The reopening demonstrated that Tehran could calm the crisis if others responded on acceptable terms. The reclosure demonstrated that Tehran could reignite it if they refrained. Taken together, they send a message: the strait cannot be treated as open by default, while Iran itself believes it remains under siege. Why this matters far beyond the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy choke points, carrying around 1/5 of global oil and LNG flows. When access becomes uncertain, the consequences do not stay local. They spread through oil markets, freight rates, insurance costs, supply chains, and strategic calculations far beyond the Gulf. There is also a second-order effect. Once repeated disruption becomes conceivable, the old assumption that Hormuz will ultimately remain open by default starts to weaken. Even partial interference can change behavior. Companies reroute, insurers reprice, governments recalculate. That means the damage can last longer than any single closure. The deeper logic, the simplest strategic reading, is this: Iran reopened the strait because reopening made it look disciplined, conditional, and potentially dealable. It lowered immediate pressure, supported ceasefire diplomacy, and gave Tehran a chance to collect concessions while keeping operational control. Iran then tightened restrictions again because a partially reopened strait, without meaningful easing of U.S. pressure, risked weakening its leverage. Once Tehran judged that the wider chokehold remained in place while it was being asked to normalize commerce, the tactical logic of reopening broke down. So the sequence is not confusing once it is viewed through bargaining rather than goodwill. Reopen to test the other side. Reimpose pressure when the test fails. What happens next? The most likely near-term outcome is not a clean full reopening or a clean permanent closure. It is oscillation, narrow access, renewed threats, controlled convoys, maritime incidents, and constant bargaining over what open even means. The most dangerous outcome is confrontation at sea. Reports of gunfire, as vessels attempted to cross, show how easily the situation can slide from coercive signaling into miscalculation. The most underestimated outcome is psychological and structural. Even if some traffic resumes, the assumption that the passage is reliably open may already be damaged. Once markets believe this choke point has become politically conditional, the strategic consequences outlast the immediate crisis. The real answer, in one line: Iran reopened the Strait of Hormuz as part of a temporary diplomatic and financial strategy within a ceasefire framework. It then tightened restrictions again because Tehran concluded that the underlying pressure against it had not eased enough to justify keeping that access in place. That is why the sequence looked contradictory, but was actually consistent. The reopening was never the end of the crisis. It was one move inside it. And the renewed restrictions are a reminder that access to one of the world's most important energy choke points is no longer being treated as routine navigation. It is being used as leverage in a wider war-shaped negotiation. And that means it can be granted, narrowed, or withdrawn whenever Tehran thinks the balance of pressure demands it.